All right. Well, the screen says starting soon at 2 p.m. and it's 2:02. So I think it's time for us to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ray Sullivan, and I'm the lucky person who gets to be the executive director at the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. CHRA is the national association that represents community housing, and our members are nonprofit, co-op, and public housing providers across the country, also provincial and territorial bodies, agencies that support folks who are unhoused, advocacy groups, associations, individuals, and more. So whoever you are in the audience today, there's room for you under CHRA's big tent. I'm coming to you from the CHRA offices in downtown Ottawa on Algonquin Anishinaabeg territory. And Ottawa is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people and has been a place of trade and gathering for millennia. So I want to pay respect to the Algonquin Anishinaabeg Nation and its people who have and continue to care for this territory, and I'm honored to live and work here. I also recognize that reconciliation is incomplete without housing reconciliation. And we who are settlers or descendants of settlers, we've displaced the original peoples from their homes, and that is also very much a housing issue. I'm really pleased to introduce our guest today. He is the Member of Parliament from Beaches East York, and as of 45 days ago is also the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure, and Communities. So welcome, Nate Erskine-Smith.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be here, and welcome everyone who I see the participants continue to increase, so it's great to be joined by so many people.
Yeah, thanks. So we're going to chat for about half an hour and then open up to questions from the audience. So for folks in the audience, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Use the chat to connect with each other, but if you have a question for the minister, use the Q&A button, and our fantastic CHRA staff team behind the scenes will moderate those questions. And then you'll be invited to come up and actually speak the question yourself for the minister. So let's get rolling. So Nate, I've been working in nonprofit housing for 25 years now, and sometimes I feel like the little kid who cried wolf. I've been talking about a housing crisis for decades, and
Yeah.
now there's one here, and it's bigger even than I imagine.
Yeah.
What do you think is the federal role in getting us out of this?
I think there are a number of different roles for the federal government to play. The first thing to acknowledge is that it's not just the federal government's role. All levels of government have to pull together on this in a serious way, and everyone has different areas of jurisdiction. In some cases, I think the federal government can play a strong role, and I think increasingly we're seeing that role played in using the federal spending power to get other levels of government and other orders of government to be more ambitious. And so, I was just in Sudbury delivering check to Mayor Lefebvre and council there through the Housing Accelerator Fund. And the goal there through that program is to make sure that barriers to getting supply built are being removed. You're moving towards ending exclusionary zoning. And so using the spending power in that way, I think is incredibly important. At the same time, the federal government used to be more involved, especially on the non-market side, and again using its spending power and long-term loans, contributions, making public land available in getting out of the business of housing. My general view, I'd be interested in where people see this heading, and I welcome advice on what more the federal government can do in this space. But I see, as of 2017, the re-entry of the federal government into delivering dollars towards more affordable housing and non-market housing is a good thing. I generally would say the scale isn't there to match the challenge and the scale of the challenge. And so I think there is a much stronger federal role to be played just at a particular scale. And we're starting to see there's a federal lands initiative and Canada Public Lands being made available. There are I hope to see top ups to loans and to grants. I think we have to be a bit more creative, especially, we're seeing an acquisition fund promise. We're seeing a co-op housing development fund. Both are in their infancy, frankly. And so we need to grow those, but I think expand upon those. So on the non-market side, I think there's a lot more to do. We're in the right direction. It's just a question of scale. I do think probably there's a lot more we can do also. It's not in my wheelhouse per se. I think there's a lot more we can do on treating housing as a home first and investment second. I think we do want, of course, investment dollars to build and to increase supply, especially affordable supply. I do worry about investment dollars chasing the residential resale market and displacing affordability. And so I think I'm looking at other jurisdictions and what they're doing, and I think there's some interesting work there too. But that's sort of the three ways I think about it. But mostly you're talking about the federal spending power, and then a little bit on the finance side in terms of setting the rules of the game in terms of investments and tax structures.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned scale, and that's something that I want to come back to later because I think that's one of the challenges that we face in the community housing sector is how to achieve scale individually and collectively. But I mean, the return of the federal government to this space with the National Housing Strategy was a big deal, you know, and it's a bigger commitment than we'd seen in the decades before. The return of direct lending from CMHC was a big deal. You know, CMHC right now is able to offer a 20-year fixed mortgage rate on a 50-year amortization at just above the bond rate. Like no one can match that anywhere in the private sector or elsewhere. But you know, we've come to the point where 30 years of bad policy decisions and bad program decisions at all orders of government have led to the crisis and the mess that we're in now. So it's going to take a while, hopefully not 30 years, to get ourselves out of this. Um, we've learned lessons over the past 8 years through the National Housing Strategy. What do you think should be the biggest priority for the federal government, say, over the next 2 years?
I mean, in many ways, it's about protecting progress. I mean, we're gonna look. It's an election year, and it's gonna be difficult to navigate through an election year where you've got a real choice around. Even when we talk about the lack of scale, you've got across the aisle folks talking about removing that funding entirely from the affordable space, saying we shouldn't be in the business at all as a government. And I do think we have to recognize the politics, and there's a housing crisis in many different ways. It's an acute crisis in that there is, we see a growth of homelessness despite the federal government reaching home its homelessness funding by 400% to $560 million a year. That crisis isn't abating, and we need to make sure we have an evidence-based, compassionate solution that treats people with dignity and helps get people housed through housing first. So, there's the immediate crisis in front of you. There's the crisis of, I was just shooting a video on Gerrard Street at Kingsmount here in the east end of Toronto. I grew up on Kingsmount. Two teachers, my parents, could afford a house there, and good luck to them affording a house today. And young people, you know, middle class Canadians are unable to afford places in the communities that they grew up in. And so I think that is its own crisis too, that sense of generational unfairness
Yeah.
and the injustice of it. That's a productivity challenge when we don't build enough housing. And I know you've got a report around the economic benefits of community housing in particular. So that's all to say there are many challenges and different political pressures, especially around delivering for middle class Canadians, I think are going to be at the fore. My own personal view of where I think we can make the biggest difference. I think it probably tracks with your view as well, based on the reports and advocacy I've seen. When I talk about scale, I just think the public role, we've now, I think there's a consensus around addressing NIMBYism and getting more homes built and delivering supply. You're going to hear every party talk about building supply. I think we just, despite getting the federal government back in the game in 2017, I don't know that we have fully come to terms with the how we can truly unlock as much community and non-market housing as we really can and drive long-term affordability. And I recognize that there are competing tensions there, right? Like what are you going to do for me now in this election to help me afford a home versus how are you going to structurally fix the system that has structurally come undone over the last 2 to 3 decades?
Yeah, and one of the things we've seen over the past couple of years is that those pain points of the housing crisis have reached a wider range of families and a wider range of,
Yes.
of income groups.
Yeah.
The
Although the
National
one thing I gotta
Housing,
say, Ray, I was someone said the other day, Minister Erskine-Smith needs a plan for the middle class, and I would just emphasize uh, there are many different policies that we need to, we have a really serious housing plan. I think that's pretty comprehensive as of last year before my time. I plan to build on that, and I want to continue to put new ideas on the table. I just want to emphasize non-market community housing, co-op housing, middle class Canadians depend upon that housing too. And I just worry that sometimes people get in this frame of, market housing is for the middle class and non-market housing is for, people who are struggling on the streets in some way. No, no, no. My parents lived in a co-op when I was born. Co-ops are for middle class Canadians. Non-market housing is for middle class. I just think I want to break down that. I don't know if it's a stigma, but I want to break down that barrier in some ways because I think that is that's a part of a fault line that is developing our politics that I want to push back on a little bit.
yeah, agreed. So, and in the National Housing Strategy, there's a graphic that's been reproduced everywhere. Some people have criticized it, but it shows the continuum of
Yeah,
of
exactly.
housing.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that it reinforces is that, you know, whether we're talking about someone living in a tent in a park or someone living in a $6 million mansion somewhere, it's one interconnected housing market and one interconnected housing system. And what happens in one part of that line has ripple effects and affects the others as well. But CMHC published a paper a couple of years ago calling for an additional 3.5 million homes to rebalance supply and demand and restore affordability. But the thinking behind that was based on this trickle down idea that if you just build more private market housing, that'll somehow lead to greater affordability. And I think I'm seeing a lot of cracks in that logic right now. So, look what's going on in your hometown in Toronto right now. Housing starts are tanking. There's not a lot of multi-residential being built at all. We're going backwards on supply and not forwards. So, what's wrong with that system, and what does it mean for affordable housing, that boom bust cycle that is dealing with something fundamental to people's livelihoods and well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The market will deliver for the market, and we do need more market supply. I mean, I don't want to shy away from that conversation either. That's why I mentioned at the outset we need to remove barriers where administrative delays are getting in the way, where you've got zoning regulations that stand in the way. I've been at not planning meetings. I've been at tenant meetings where they're saying we've got to protect, the neighborhood character and it's single family homes detached. And, you want to break down those barriers and remove those barriers for the market, delivering for the market. Of course we do. But, the Housing Accelerator Fund, I think, has been quite successful in doing a lot of that with 200 municipalities across the country. And that's important work. I think, when you look at interest rates right now, when you look at the costs of getting homes built, there's more we could probably do when we look at housing enabling infrastructure to make sure that the federal, provincial, and municipal governments are working in tandem and cooperation to drive down the costs of building homes. I mean, there's more we can do to unlock the market, delivering for the market, no doubt. But I also would say, when we look at the long-term challenges in this country, when you look at what other countries are successfully doing in the non-market space, we should have our eyes on both of those balls at the same time, and we should be focused on both. And where there are, as you say, ups and downs, and if the market's not, if interest rates are where they're at, and the math doesn't pencil in a particular way in a given moment of time, well, if we have a sustained investment on the non-market side, that's gonna pay important dividends too.
Yeah, and this gets discussed a lot when we talk about trying to lean into the offsite factory production, panelized and modular homes. There's a big upfront capital investment, and those companies that are doing this need to know that there's a steady pipeline of clients out there. This is a role that
Yeah, on
community
that,
housing can
I would
play.
actually not to completely send us sideways, but I was mentioning to you before we started recording. We're going to go through a budget cycle and budget process here. I would welcome ideas from folks, and specifically around there has been work towards an industrial strategy on home building, including prefab and modular. And on that, I'm looking pretty seriously at this idea of how do we get that market moving as quickly as we can? Well, one thing, and again, it's the federal spending power, but if you were able to guarantee a certain purchase order as a federal government, those units would ultimately get delivered to different municipalities across this country, and you'd have to have a regional approach to it, of course. But how do you guarantee purchase orders at a large enough scale that you can drive down costs, but you can guarantee that work, that then those businesses are going to invest in their own businesses, and they know they've got the work, and they're going to be able to grow and thrive. And so I think we can hopefully kill a couple birds with one stone with a program like that, where we're not only delivering homes in the end, modular homes in the end, to municipalities that are making public land available or otherwise, but we're also really generating an industry here in Canada on that front.
Yeah, and this is a role that community housing can play. It's often a good counter-cyclical investment when times are tough, when there's a recession. Um, we can fill in those gaps to ensure that pipeline of modular and prefab home. When you talk about stability, I mean, I'm really envious of Denmark, and I got a chance to visit some of our counterparts there a couple of years ago. They've been really successful in creating non-market housing at scale through a sector-led revolving loan fund. So, when they're building nonprofit housing, they're not dependent on having a friendly federal government or a friendly national government. They're not dependent on the same kind of finance cycles, interest rates, and market conditions. They, as a community housing sector, control the fund that lends out money for non-market development. I'm jealous of them, and I hope to go back and visit and learn more about them. But I'm hoping we can bring those kinds of ideas back here to Canada as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So I think there are two places where I would want to go steal ideas, and one is for sure from other jurisdictions. I mean, I've done a bit of a read into targets that France has on non-market housing and their success in driving, I think, from around 2000 on more non-market and community housing. You mentioned Denmark. I read Home Truths, Professor Weitzman's book, and I had her on the podcast before I took on this role. Fortuitous timing as far as that went, actually, all things considered. But Denmark was mentioned in the book and was interesting. It's just, again, different loan and financing models where I think, if I'm getting it right, it was over a 45-year loan window, you're looking at the first 30 years to pay down the project, and the next 15 years finances the next one. And anyway, so there are no question ideas we've got to take from other jurisdictions and implement them here as much as we can, frankly. I think there's a level of ambition we need to see here. On the second thing, I do think we also need to learn from our own past. And we don't have to look too far afield, actually, to see what it looked like when more non-market housing was getting built. And it really comes down to a coordinated approach between public lands, contributions, and grants, sometimes spread out over a number of years. The contributions themselves amortized over a number of years, and then long-term, low-interest guaranteed loans. I mean, the tools are, we know what tools we need. It's just a matter of making sure that they are working together as best as we can make them work together.
And I gotta give mention to Finland as well, which has effectively ended chronic homelessness through a massive supportive housing supply program. And we're bringing 30 folks over to Helsinki in September on a
Oh,
study
cool.
tour to learn what they're doing. You can come with us if you want.
I mean, I don't know how long kicking around given the uncertain state of politics, but I mean, I would love to. I have done a bit of a deeper dive on that front, and we made a series of announcements recently around increasing emergency supports on the federal side, and I was pretty clear. I mean, there's the emergency in front of us. There's the need to address emergency supports. We had a tragic loss. A woman died. She was in, living on the Danforth, and obviously it's been a really tough winter already. And there is that immediate crisis. And then if you are serious about solving this problem in a longer term way, it does come down to housing first. And Finland's done this in spades, but how do we make sure there are those supportive units, and it's coming in with capital dollars to build. It's making sure we're acquiring and retrofitting, and then it's making sure that we've got those wraparound supports at the same time, and supporting social service agencies with a more hands-on approach. And we know what we need to do. We just need to do it at scale, and it's frustrating at times, I think, just many good, well-intentioned organizations, well-intentioned governments, but we do need to operate recognize the scale of the crisis, because it's, I crisscrossed Ontario a year and a half ago for a provincial leadership, and this came up everywhere, and it came up from the business community to say, we need to solve this problem on our main streets. It came up from, advocates who work with people who are unhoused. It came up from people who are going, I'm seeing tents in my community that I never saw before. How do we help? How do we make sure that we get people housed? I mean, we know what we need. We know what we need to do. I said this yesterday when I was at Waterloo. A young person asked me, like, do we need to do more research? Do we need to, do more analysis? And I was like, we actually just need to really deliver at scale.
And as you're saying, we've got to solve the emergency, the problem that's right in front of us today, but we also have to make sure we're solving the problem that's coming down the road 10 years from now, and investing in those
Yes.
longer term solutions. So I've got I guess I've had a bunch of questions, but I got one question I'm really glad I get to ask you, because I think it's more of a political question than a policy question.
I can answer both.
Well, yeah, but we've got, you mentioned the economic study on productivity that we did just over a year ago with
Yes.
Deloitte Canada. So, it showed that investments in community housing will pay for themselves in terms of economic benefits within 2 or 3 years. And there's actually mountains of evidence that
Yeah.
investments in community housing, particularly supportive housing, lead to big net savings. The at-home chez soi study, here in Canada, a
Yep. Oh yeah.
clinical trial showed for every dollar invested, you're saving between $3 and $10 elsewhere in the system.
Yeah.
If you piled all of these reports, all of this evidence up, you'd probably be able to build a small apartment building out of all of the paper. But why is it that this evidence isn't making its way into government budgets, policy planning, and action?
Okay, so I don't have probably a complete. Other people probably would supplement this answer, but I have a few thoughts politically about this. And one is, and I mentioned this already, if people think of community housing as something for someone else, then it doesn't drive their own vote and doesn't drive politics in quite the same way. And so I do think, and we're going to see, I hope, announcements around co-op housing before the end of March. I'm hopeful for that. And there's an example where many people I've spoken to. I'm 40 years old. I've spoken to people my age and who we our families, our friends, like co-op housing was around us and it was just a part of our lives. And I do think we have to break down that barrier that is sort of there's a certain kind of house that I expect to live in and buy and it's going to be a market home and that's the right thing versus what is the solution for someone who is a nurse or a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer. I mean like what does housing look like for them and what do they want out of housing? And it's got to be a place to call home and it's got to be security of tenure, and in some cases that's going to mean ownership, and it might mean an ownership and I rented until 3 years ago basically, and I didn't have a backyard, but there was a park across the street. It's like what it was a duplex. I mean, in some cases people will be renting like that. In other cases, people are looking for a place to call home that they own, but it will be in a multi-unit building. I mean, there are many different ways of thinking about a place to call home, and I just think we have to push back a little bit on the idea that there's one answer for the middle class. But home ownership is, of course, I think a dream for many people. And so for those who see that running away from incomes, I think we also have to say, here's how we ensure that this is a rung on a ladder to get you there. And I've had conversations, I think very highly of a number of councillors who are speaking out in support of community housing and deliver community housing in their communities. And I was just speaking with a councillor in Sault Ste. Marie, Councillor Dufour, and he was saying, you know what, like we need to make sure that people understand that there's also, to your point of the continuum of housing. I mean, if I want to get to a place in the end, I've got to save up money and I've got to, maybe I start, my parents started in a co-op before they ended up buying their place. And so I do think we have to make sure that if that continuum is broken, if the bottom rungs of the ladder are completely disappearing on people, then good luck to them to getting to the top of the ladder. And so I do think we have to think about how we articulate and just explain to people how community housing is going to impact their lives in a more direct way. I think obviously the story on homelessness, we failed, I think, to address the fact in some ways. I tried to start to do this, but when you see those emergency supports and that there's a moment of urgent crisis, well, people should also know that this is partly a consequence of decades of underinvestment, but also the province in certain provinces, province of Ontario here, but provinces reducing their spending on social housing and community housing. And so again, if we want to solve a particular problem in front of us, there's a long-term structural solution that we need to make sure we're making investments in. And then the last piece, to your point about productivity, we are going, our productivity is lagging, and we have to think about housing and productivity together. And if we want talented people to live in our communities, and we want talented people to stay in our communities, housing has to be affordable in our communities. And so not only do we need projects, shovels in the ground and things getting built and jobs created, and that's all important. And there's there are social outcomes that come with that too. But making sure that we are addressing the productivity challenge head on and we're tying the connection between productivity and housing, I think is critically important. So I think that's all to say. And I'm sure I'm missing elements of this, but I think if we're only talking about community housing because we believe in community housing and we're not tying it to other issues that people care about, generational fairness and the ability to have a security of tenure, a place to call home, and hopefully buy at some point in their life to look after their family. If we're not, looking at the productivity challenge, if we're not looking at how we have a long-term solution to addressing encampments and homelessness, community housing is at the center of so much of it. And I think we also frankly, have to tell, and this is the last thing I'll say, we have to tell a story about what Canada is not doing that other countries are doing. And I don't think we are, I know advocates like yourself and Professor Weissman and many others are, but I don't think in politics we've had enough people who have pointed to what it could be, because we see what other countries are capable of doing.
Yeah, and there's a lot of capacity here in Canada. And we mentioned scale earlier on, and I said I wanted to get back to scale. As in Canada, only about 4% of the housing stock is community housing. That's less than half of the OECD and G7 average. It's actually less than in the United States. We're challenging ourselves and we're challenging the country to more than double that in the next decade. Probably that's going to look like a lot more mixed income housing than we might have
Yep.
seen
Yeah,
in
for sure.
some years, and you mentioned when you were born, your parents lived in a co-op. My first connection to community housing was as a market rent tenant in a mixed income development. Um, After we've more than doubled in the next decade, I think we need to shoot for 20% and get there through mixed income developments.
And speaking, I mentioned France earlier, but my understanding is that the targets that France sets is that 20% mark. I mean, it's
Yeah.
this is not some pie in the sky idea. Other countries, other democratic, countries that care about the same things that we do are able and capable of doing this. It just takes a sustained political commitment.
And we know that at least 20% of households can't afford market rates for
Exactly.
housing. So there needs to be those kinds of alternatives in a broad range. I want to go to some of the questions from our audience. I told the staff I'd give them a heads up before this comes, but it's time now. And our first question is going to come from Lee Bursey out in New Brunswick. Are you on, Lee? Go ahead, Lee.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Wonderful. Grateful for the opportunity to speak, Mr. Minister. I just wanted to chime in on the fact that, granted, I appreciated your comments about the accelerator fund and how obviously it's it's been at the talk of a lot of very important political conversation in terms
Yeah.
of whether or not it survives an election or survives a change in administration, etc. But since there's been changes in the ministry you represent and Parliament prorogued, there are a number of applications and second round applications, people who've already gone through this process, people who maybe haven't been successful previously, who reapplied because of the
Yep.
specifications of the application, who are waiting for responses, and those responses have slowed, and they're not necessarily getting anywhere with those responses. They're not getting a clear picture as to what's to come, and I guess to some degree there's probably some level of defeatism that just we're anticipating that maybe it's just lost to political conversation. It's lost to the uncertainty of our times. And I know I can't speak for, my home community's council, who I know were very involved in helping to put together an application. But here in Miramichi, I know that there's a lot of people who are very curious. This is already year over year funding without brackets
Yeah.
in place that could very well be lost with a change of administration. But at the same time, that money now could be very beneficial towards getting some of these projects off the ground and really
Yeah, no, of course.
next.
So thanks for that. I mean, the Housing Accelerator Fund is incredibly important. I worry when I hear conservatives say they're going to cut it, because it is a program that has driven municipalities to change the rules of the game. And I worry sometimes that we measure success by, look, the ultimate measurement of success is our homes getting built, and what are the housing starts and foundation poured and housing completions. But actually, I measure success of the Housing Accelerator Fund differently, which is how many municipalities have changed the rules of the game to get more housing built. And that's ending exclusionary zoning. It is making sure that processes are expedited, including e-permitting. It's making sure that public lands are available to drive more affordability. And just on process. I really have been able to hit the ground running, because as soon as I was appointed, it was it's December 20th, holidays hit, and I've really been able to hit the ground running with the whole team as of early January. We've the second round of Housing Accelerator Fund announcements have all been made in Ontario because we knew a provincial election was coming. We had to get them out. No one's going to get lost in the politics of the day. We've got every single successful applicant to that second round of the Housing Accelerator Fund will know in the next week or two. And so I would say it's coming. It's not been held up by prorogation by any means. The government continues to govern, and those decisions are forthcoming in the very short term.
All right. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Nate. We're going to go all the way to the other side of the country now and bring on Margaret Fove from the Aboriginal Housing Management Association in BC.
Nate, hello. Good afternoon, I guess, for you. It's good morning for us out here in British Columbia. Hope everybody's doing well from coast to coast. Nice to meet you, Minister Nate Erskine-Smith.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I look forward to actually meeting you soon in a follow-up meeting. I really like a couple of things that I heard from you this morning, in particular around that breaking down those. I don't know if we want to call them myths, but that miscommunication that defines who is supposed to fit where in the housing spectrum. And I agree with you. I think that there's been a large misconception that somehow non-market is for, a certain class or a certain population, and market housing is, for another. So I agree. I think that there's a better way for us to be working together and better way for us to be using our languages. I do have a little bit of a concern with one of the comments you just made in answer to Lee Bursey's statement around no one's going to get lost in the fray. And I know you were talking about a different pocket of funding at this particular
Yeah, I was.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing you're talking about is a bigger challenge.
It's a bigger challenge for
Yeah.
sure. And my real reality here, because it's taken us decades. I mean, I can say
Yeah.
it's been
I know.
since 2017, but it's been decades of pushing this
I
country to
met with
recognize.
John. I met with John Gordon yesterday, and
Great.
he gave me a very good advocate, but he gave me a decades long rundown, and it's how we've come to this place, and then we're on the precipice of a good amount of money making a big amount of difference,
Yeah.
and so this is where, to be clear, prorogation is not the challenge here. The challenge is. There are many monies, and it's not just, and for folks listening who are not familiar with this, it's the urban and rural and northern Indigenous housing dollars, which it's a significant sum of money. Ultimately, it was a total $4 billion fund, but we're looking at dollars that are set to really start next year. That's not the only program. You're looking at the Rental Protection Fund, which I've spoken to Ray about at some length. We've got the Co-op Housing Development Fund. All of these funds really are multi-year, and so you're looking at on earn. It's the biggest chunks. The most of it starts next year, and then the year after, then the year after. Same with the Rental Protection Fund and then the Co-operative Housing Development Fund. I'm hoping to make a couple announcements, but then again, it's over a 5-year window, and there are dollars each year in an equal amount. So the challenge is just the uncertainty of electoral politics. So if we have a conservative government, to be frank, I would expect all of that to disappear. If we are able to get through even one vote, if we're able to have, I don't expect to have a supply and confidence agreement with the Bloc or the NDP to survive until October. But even if we were to just get one vote, we could pull some dollars forward and make a bigger difference and get through one parliamentary vote and get through supply at the end of March. So that is the current challenge is without parliamentary approval to pull dollars forward, we can't get those dollars out the door. And Parliament has approved a certain track of spending. And so those dollars are at risk, frankly, because of politics. And it's not, I just want to emphasize, it's not because of prorogation, it's just because of we've got a certain track of parliamentary approval, and we've got to get through, if we're going to change that parliamentary track of approval and pull dollars forward in any way or expedite them in any way, we need Parliament to agree. And right now, I know I've spoken to, on EARN, I've spoken to Gary Nansangri, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Affairs. I've spoken to Patty Haidu, who's deeply committed on the Indigenous services side, but we need a parliamentary approval to pull dollars forward and get it done. So that's the current challenge.
I guess the real challenge for me is that when this was promised in last year's budget, it was told that it would start in 2024. And we know that the RFP process
Yeah.
went out in January of 2023, and
Yep.
we didn't get any answers for well over a year. In fact, we don't have any answers. I mean, I would
Yep.
say that's like a little
Yeah.
bit of a disingenuous statement to say it wasn't supposed to roll out till 2025 when we started the
No, but
process in
on the major dollars.
2023.
Yeah, so the RFP process concluded in March 2024. The there are I'm gonna get the it's under I feel like it's under $20 million that could flow this year to stand up the organization, as it were. It might be 14 or $15 million to stand it up, but the actual dollars to get, because we're talking about standing up a national housing center, and so the dollars that would actually flow to get housing built were not set to flow until 2020 fiscal year 2025.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Nate. We've got a fantastic number of questions, and we're going to try to get as many as we can. The next one we're going to zoom. Actually, we're going to come to your hometown, and we have Emmanuel Mellis.
Thanks, Rick. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you, Emmanuel.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this session, Minister. You kind of addressed my questions in trying to respond to Margaret, but in the art of the possible and what's doable given election year, what do you think can be done given all the limitations that you have, and more importantly, from a civil society perspective, what can be done at our end to try to support your role? And I come to you from work that the Network for the Advancement of Black Community has been doing dating back to Minister Hussein when he was in the portfolio. Delays around the rollout of the Black Carve-out, for example, that was announced, and other things. So we are in this time crunch, and I want to get a sense of what are the priorities that you're working in terms of moving things forward, and more importantly, what can we do to support the work? Thank you.
I appreciate it. So, look, I would like to, I would like to think I have more time to get things done, but I'm operating. And look, we might have an election. Election has to be this year. It could be October. I'm operating under the assumption that it could well be the end of March. And so, because every other party has said that they, don't intend to support the government beyond that at the moment. So, with that short window of time, I sort of came in saying, how do we get the most done that we possibly can in a short period of time? And some things like the Rental Protection Fund, for example, which I was very interested in, it's an acquisition fund. I would like to see more of that kind of work and that to be scaled up. But frankly, there isn't going to be a lot to be done in at least on my end before the end of March to get that moving. There's calls for expression of interest that will be launched, but we're not going to get dollars spent to get acquisitions going. So instead, it's what is it within the realm of the possible, and it's to Lee's point around the Housing Accelerator Fund, getting announcements out the door, making sure we got deals in place, making sure we're policing it in some cases in an effective way for municipalities that have had the dollars and are falling away from their timelines and milestones. It's making sure we're getting transit dollars out the door and we're delivering on those deals with municipalities, that long-term, stable, predictable funding. It's making sure that we are on the affordable housing side through the community stream, but also the rapid housing stream, and also the apartment construction loan program, making sure that no dollars are lapsed. We're getting as much in place as possible, not only for this year, but in the coming year, we can at least get some negotiation commitments made, even though the dollars won't flow till next year. And then on the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, that's housing enabling infrastructure, we've got deals in place with different provinces that are soon to be announced, but we've got in Ontario a challenge where they're in an election right now and they weren't really at the table before that. So it's a $1.9 billion sort of set of money, 1.5 province to federal, but also another 400 million in the direct delivery that the share for Ontario would be about 400 million. And so you're looking at about $1.9 billion directly to municipalities to deliver federal dollars to, again, drive down the cost of home building, which I think is the real goal on the market side, and housing enabling infrastructure, reducing or freezing or stabilizing development charges where we can, or at least driving them down on affordable housing projects at the bare minimum. And again, I think shaping the conversation in some ways, and this is where I would in the short time I've got, whether it's on the non-market side or reframing things on the market side, is about removing barriers and driving down the cost of home building. I think the way we talk about housing matters, and how we set priorities really matters. Where I could use the help of civil society, or we could use the help of civil society. I mean, one is, and this is to the previous question around Indigenous housing, certain real priorities, whether it's co-op housing, acquisition funds to protect affordable rentals, or urban, whether it's urban, rural, or northern, but Indigenous housing all across Canada. We need, if we had one parliamentary vote to pull dollars forward and to really make a difference on the housing file, that would be huge. But we need the NDP or Bloc support. And so where civil society actors can not only push me to do the right thing, but push parliamentary colleagues to do the right thing so we can reach a deal like that, that would be huge. And we would get a lot done, and we would, I think, protect progress to an even greater degree. The second thing is just in terms of what comes next. And so if there are ideas, and this is sort of my call for all of you, if you have ideas that you don't see or hear me talking about, if you have ideas that you go, you know what, it's great that you're on the right track here, but you could really improve programs in this way. Or if you say, you know what, you're on the right track, but you need 5 times the amount of money or twice the amount of money. I welcome all ideas, whether it's on industrial strategy of home building, whether it's on the non-market side, whether it's barriers to getting the market to build, whether it is treating housing as a home first and addressing incentives and the incentive structures we got in place there. I would welcome all ideas as we get through a budget cycle, but also knowing there's an election on the horizon. How do we make sure we're setting ourselves up for success to say we've got a comprehensive plan? We moved a little too slowly, but we're on the right track, and we're ramping up our ambition. And here's what comes next.
Thanks, Amand. Great to hear from you. And Nate, you mentioned the Rental Protection Fund. CHRA and our partners are ready to stand up an acquisition fund whenever you're ready to move with us.
I know, but just on that, and this gets to the earn problem. It's like there's the standing up, and then there's the delivery of it. I just wish I could pull dollars forward to say you're going to stand it up and deliver it. Instead, what it looks like is the structure of just the parliamentary approval is you're going to be able to stand some things up and then really not put them into action until after we get another parliamentary vote. Well,
yeah, the Indigenous community housing sector did stand up an organization ready to deliver funds
Ray,
into communities.
I wish, yes. That's a whole other conversation, and I have learned a lot, and I obviously wasn't there when many of these decisions were being made, but I have a lot of thoughts on that and I hope there's a way to make sure everyone's at the table and we get as much Indigenous housing built as possible in the months and years ahead. It's just getting through a bit of a headache with where things are at with supply and the parliamentary vote and the way things have rolled on that front.
I know we'll continue talking about that one. So we talked about different housing options, and we didn't get a chance to talk specifically about affordable home ownership, but there's a handful of fantastic organizations across the country that are doing nonprofit affordable home ownership. So I'm going to go to the GTA, to Joe Deschaines-Smith from Trillium Housing. Go ahead, Joe.
Thanks, Ray. And Minister, nice to see you again.
You can call me Nate, Joe. You don't, it's nice to hear your voice.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to annoy Ray and reformat my question a little bit, given everything that's been said. I work with sister organizations like Habitat for Humanity and Options for, and I'm going to give 3 examples of a disconnect between where I see, your leadership and the cabinet direction of the government saying we want to prioritize housing, and what doesn't happen at the staff level. So the first one has to do with regulatory changes that come out of CMHC and OSFI, which is the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions.
Yeah.
And they've made changes recently that inhibit the ability for families to get a first mortgage from their bank when they're working with nonprofits like myself at Trillium. And these are like technical changes, and we've been pushing to try and get them to reverse them. I know it's inadvertent consequences of them making changes to work with the banks, which is their priority, but it's having a direct impact on families being able to access support from our nonprofits and move into an affordable entry-level home and free up rent.
And Joe, I'm folks from Options for Homes had reached out to me as well. I have this on my this was just last Thursday that it was flagged for me for the first time. So I have this on my list. I don't have a clear answer for you yet, but this is on my list to be seized with and to deal with.
Thank you. I didn't expect a solution. I was wanting to kind of raise the issue.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
But
yeah,
but it also goes back to like the 3 examples of the disconnect. So, and the other 2, and I might be putting my hand on the 3rd rail here and electrocuting myself, but you know, every year CMHC earns a profit of over $2 billion. That's been going on for a decade. And that profit is earned, you know, by overcharging for mortgage insurance to modest income families who are required to buy it by CMHC because they do have a quasi monopoly position. And I kind of wonder, why can't you direct CMHC, and I guess in consultation with finance, because they're expecting that $2 billion dividend each year, and say, let's operate this organization on a break-even basis. If you want to raise funds, go to Parliament and apply a tax or a fee. But you know, secondary profits out of an agency that's supposed to be helping us deliver affordable housing by adding that kind of extra cost, it seemed to me a great disconnect between what you're saying and trying to accomplish and what happens. And I'll give you quickly my 3rd one. It has to do with the GST. Years ago, I worked for the province at finance when the GST rolled out. And at the time, there was a break for modest entry-level homes, and they would have a reduction on the GST. And the federal government promised to review that each year and adjust it for inflation, and it's never been changed. So, you know, everybody who buys a home, they paid the GST, HST. If the home is priced below a certain level, there is a reduction, but that price level threshold has never been adjusted. If you adjusted that for inflation, as I think was intended at the time, and again, you know, this is a finance question, not your question, but it just is a 3rd example of it's tough for you to make sure all those little things happen, and maybe the answer is more about do you work with you know, your deputy and others to translate issues. Sorry, I think I did too much speaking and not enough asking.
No, I'll just briefly touch on the latter 2, because the first one I just need to be directly engaged with CMHC on and figure out how we solve it. But on the role of CMHC, like that's not just the direction that I would be able to give. Even I think in consultation with the finance minister, I think there's when I've gone to them with some ideas, there are again, you need you know, this is a crown corp that has been created by Parliament, and so if you are going to change how it conducts business in some way, there are so long as it's in keeping with the authority that I have as minister or finance has, you're okay. But I think if it's a structural change in that way, it maybe is a conversation for Parliament. The other part of it though is I do think, and I've had some preliminary conversations with policy folks on this front, is just what would it look like if the goal wasn't to what if the goal was to break even, but to say we're long-term low-interest loans and they're going to be more favorable loans to drive deeper affordability, and we're not. It's about, you know, so long as you're able to cover your operating and your loan loss, then what more do you need? And so I do think there's a thoughtful conversation about how we get to that place and what that looks like. On the GST side, let me just say, so this is where I was sort of intimating when I was talking about the politics and getting different pressures on the politics, when Ray was saying sort of what are the 1 or 2 things that you think you're gonna have to deal with. We've got a promise from the opposition to cut, exempt GST on new builds under $1 million, and in principle, like you know, to your point, it makes sense to exempt GST off of essential goods. And of course, if you call a house a place, if it's a place to call home, and you're buying it as a place to call home, it is an essential good. Now, there are a couple knock-on challenges to that promise that the Conservatives have made. At least there aren't guardrails around it, so it will help. You know, there's an investor class that will obviously benefit from that in a significant way to, you know, displace affordability potentially, and that's its own challenge. And whether you can build guardrails in, and it would maybe, you know, maybe allow you to reduce the secondary concern, which is just an opportunity cost question. Because when I've asked on the finance side, how much would this cost? It's $3 to $4 billion a year. And so then the question becomes, I mean, there's some silly politics where, oh, we're going to pay for it by cutting the Housing Accelerator Fund and the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund. But even if you were to cut both those programs, you'd still be short $2+ billion a year. And so how are you going to find that money? And not only where are you going to find that money, but what does it come at the expense of? And so I'm not like in opposition to it from a sort of philosophical or political perspective, but I just, from an opportunity cost perspective, if my goal is to drive down the cost of building homes and getting homes built, I do wonder, is $1 on the GST side the best bang for your dollar, or is $1 on reducing development charges and delivering housing enabling infrastructure? And both, if they're both seeking to drive down the cost of homeownership in some ways, where are you going to get the best return? Or in a perfect world, you do everything, but we don't live in that perfect world with constrained finances. So that's my only challenge back that I'm trying to think through.
All right. Thanks, Minister, and thanks, Joe. Those of us who follow Joe on LinkedIn probably suspected he was going to go after the CMHC dividend. Next up, coming down to here in Ottawa, an organization that I'm quite fond of, CCOC and CADCO, we have Adrian Shute.
Hello, and I'll take your cue to Joe, and I'll call you Nate, although I don't think we've met. But or I can call you Mr. Minister. It doesn't feel right.
It doesn't feel right.
No, it doesn't feel right. Just wanted to ask a couple of questions around the Affordable Housing Fund in the short term, the time that we know that we have, what we can do to improve that, and sort of setting the stage. I think there's a couple of areas that we see as CADCO, a real estate development consultant that serves nonprofits. Areas where things take time and get hung up. And so there's sort of two key areas where I think we see projects slowing down and an opportunity in the next few months for things to really speed up in the time that we have ahead of us. The first part is around the requirements to get them in the door, which is one of the key ones being a Class B estimate, which is a level of construction costing that requires the nonprofits to go through immense expense and take on an excessive amount of risk, in my opinion, up front. So that is an area that I think we could really look at if we wanted to try to expedite some housing in the time that we have ahead of us. Additionally to that, though, when it comes to the actual approval process, the approval process itself is, I mean, we say it's 120 days, but there's multiple points where CMHC will be hung up by an election where they have a couple of approvals within that process. And so there'll be stages that they can't move beyond from what we understand. Are you open to looking at a solution with CMHC to expedite that, to get their approvals more upfront so that they are able to continue to get this money out the door? Because unfortunately, if we can't get a loan agreement signed, we get stuck.
So a couple of things. So one is if I don't know the best way to facilitate this. Maybe I can leave my the best email in the chat or something. But I do. Let's do that. I'm going to leave an email in the chat, but because I actually genuinely want that kind of specific feedback, so I can take it to the CEO there at CMHC. We have regular meetings. I flag different considerations, and my general direction has been, let's get as much done as we can in the shortest possible time. And so on this front, where there are obstacles, where there are things we can move forward in order to make sure the work is ongoing later, like let's do as much of that as we can within the authorities that we've got. And look, we won't be able to do everything, because sometimes the pushback is, Nate, we don't have the authority to do that on the parliamentary side. You need to go back to Parliament to pull things forward and to make sure things work as quickly as we reasonably can. I'll use an example on the greener home loan side. It's wild. You have to put all your invoices up front. So a homeowner is like, even though you're not sure of everything you're going to do, instead of just saying, I'm going to draw down this invoice as it's completed, I'm going to draw down this invoice as it's completed, you got to put them all up front and do all that legwork. As an individual person going through that process is kind of an insane thing to ask, but that's as set up, and you got to go through a Treasury Board approval, which in a short period of time I might not be able to get through. So that's maybe a little thing that should be fixed that I'm not able to fix. So I don't want to say I'm able to fix everything, but I'm certainly intent on documenting all of these challenges, the recurring frustrations, the recurring administrative delays, and unnecessary sort of red tape to it, and then easing that as much as I can in a short window of time, for sure. And I will give that direction. They're already understanding that I want to move fast, and so where there are specifics that I can put in front of them, all the better. The other thing I would just want to say, just on non-market side and unlocking the AHF, and it will be harder to do in the short window that we've got before the end of March. But if we got more time, then I think this is, if I've got another fiscal year with AHF dollars to do it, and this would be where I think a further conversation on Class B estimates is especially warranted. But I really want to unlock not just on paper, the commitment to portfolio approach for non-market housing, but also how do we really drive that approach to what Ray was intimating to get to scale? And I don't just mean scale of like the country meeting its bigger commitments on non-market housing. How do we get to a place where it's not just a series of disconnected one-off transactions with CMHC, and there's good work being done all across this country in an incredible way in the non-market space, but how do we make sure that there are actors that are themselves building capacity to become regional actors, and then ultimately we get to a place where there are national actors that are able to really unlock non-market housing development in a much more serious and sophisticated way. And I think a portfolio approach is the answer to building a lot of that capacity, and making sure that the rules that we have in place are fit for purpose to really unlocking the opportunity there. I'm very interested in. So I'll put my email in the chat, but I would welcome any specifics like that. I very, very much welcome.
You know that I want to spend a whole week talking about the Affordable Housing Fund, but we're going to try and squeeze one last question in. There's an amazing movement of community land trusts that is really flourishing across the country. So we want to go to Darnell Harris. If you could make it quick, we can squeeze it in.
Yes, hi. I'm actually Frederick Peters working with Darnell. That's why I have his ID. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for this. I wanted to actually just address community land trusts, see how you feel about them, what thoughts, how could new ones be supported, the existing ones, Parkdale, Kensington Market, Circle Land Trust, look to you and your ministry for support. I said that quickly because we're running out of time. So.
I would say before I took on this role, I'd been sitting down with I think it was Raising the Roof and Tapestry and the Ottawa Community Land Trust to talk about sort of how do we deliver more innovative approaches to deliver more non-market to unlock private philanthropy and private foundations in the community housing space, but also to better partner with land trusts. I think there's a huge opportunity we have a public land. I would welcome ideas. A couple of things just with the short time we got though. One is unlocking. We're really set on unlocking the value of public land. You see that with municipalities. You see that with the Housing Accelerator Fund, and you see that with our federal lands initiative. I genuinely think we don't just need a public land bank; we need a community land bank as well, and we need to really make sure we're taking the same approach to. There are so many organizations that want to do good in the housing space. They own land and they want to make sure there's a social outcome, but they don't have capacity. They don't have any involvement or knowledge of the housing space. And so how do we make sure we are empowering community land trusts to be part of to really be a partner in what we are doing? And the second piece of it is to make sure we take the apartment construction loan program or other financing. We are doing a deal with Toronto right now. We're not yet landed it, but the idea is to do a deal with. There's sort of a carve out of long-term low-interest financing for municipalities that are really committed to, and it's for certain affordable housing projects that they're committed to. That's great. But I think more intellectually sound in some ways would be how do we make sure we carve out long-term low-interest loans for organizations that are opening up public or community land to drive affordability in a deeper way. And again, just to close with, in the history of this country, but when you look at other countries, like how do we drive affordability? What are the different things that drive up the cost of housing? If we can deliver affordability through long-term low-interest loans, through grants and contributions, and ultimately through partnerships on public and community-owned land where there's a drive to deliver social outcomes. That's how we are going to drive greater affordability. And so partnerships and empowering community land trusts has to be part of the picture for sure.
Fantastic. And as you've said, we can look to our own history for some of those exact same solutions. We've run out of time. I want to express my deepest thanks to Nate, to Minister Erskine-Smith, for joining us for this really great and frank chat. I also want to thank all the CHRA members and housers who've joined us, and those who aren't yet CHRA members. You can join CHRA and be part of the solution along with us. We've got another webinar coming up on February 20th, exactly the kind of thing that Adrian Shute was talking about, learning about some of the changes to the Affordable Housing Fund, co-hosted by CMHC in this case. On March 6th, we've got another webinar coming up focusing on eviction prevention for youth. And of course, at the end of April, the CHRA National Congress on Housing and Homelessness in beautiful Saskatoon. So I hope you can all join us at Congress, and please join us at CHRA. Thank you again, Nate, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Ray. And you might want to keep this chat open because I did leave my email there. So I know people are commenting and it's going quickly. So if people want to scroll up and catch it before the window closes, I encourage you to do that. And I would just, say thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Ray, and to the team at CHR for all the work you do, but also for opening up this dialogue and conversation. And I would just say, I hope I'm working as hard as I can to make the most of the short time that I got, but I hope there is a longer period of time to get as much done as we can. And so, part of my job is getting things done next week and next month, but part of this job is also, helping to shape the public debate around housing and what comes next in an election and making sure we are, to your point, Ray, how do we make sure that community housing is talked about in a range of different ways so that it continues to be a priority across, hopefully, the political spectrum. And so if, I just encourage everyone to be in touch with their ideas, and I hope to, I hope this isn't the last time we have a conversation, a dialogue like this.
Thank you very much. And one thing I know is that housers get it done.
That's right. That's right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.